Everything was going well on the flight, and the first-class cabin was quiet until one man politely asked the flight attendant for a glass of water for his wife. The flight attendant's response was a cold refusal, and she spoke in a way that made them feel like they didn't belong. Other passengers noticed, but no one spoke up. The flight attendant kept going, unaware that her fate was already set because the couple she had just embarrassed owned the airline, and by the time the plane landed, she wouldn't. She would be serving drinks, but she would have to make a choice that would end her career forever. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like these kinds of stories, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new one. The plane was already taking off, and people were settling into their seats. Eddie and Leora Whitmore, an elderly couple, walked slowly down the aisle with their hands together as they looked for their seats in the first-class cabin. Eddie was wearing a neatly pressed navy suit, walked with quiet confidence, and Leora, who wore an elegant but simple cream-colored dress, moved with grace. They weren't in a hurry, and they didn't seem out of place, but some passengers looked at them as if they weren't sure if they belonged. The couple, however, stayed calm, unaffected by the silent judgment around them. They found seats 2A and 2B, and carefully put their small carry-on bags in the overhead compartments. Leora sat down first, sighing softly as she leaned back her fingers. Eddie settled down next to her and looked around before pressing the button to call for the flight attendant. He didn't expect any trouble. All he wanted to do was ask for water for Leora, who had been feeling a little thirsty since their last layover. A few moments later, Mara Rowan, a senior flight attendant, came in. Her uniform was clean, and her posture was straight, but her eyes had something else in them, a quiet air of superiority. Mara had worked in first. She had been in this class for years and knew exactly the type of people who usually sat in those seats. She didn't even look at the couple's tickets, because she already had an opinion about them. She crossed her arms and waited. Eddie smiled politely and gestured toward Leora, asking if we could please have a glass of water for her because she wasn't feeling well. Maya's lips tightened a little and her posture stiffened. "Water will be served with the meal service," she said quickly, barely looking at them. Carrie's tone was rude, but it also seemed like she thought the request was an inconvenience. Eddie tilted his head slightly and kept a calm face. "I understand, but she only needs a small sip. If you could bring a glass now, that would be very kind of you," he said. Mara let out a quiet sigh, as if she had more important things to handle. "Sir, we have a schedule for a reason. If I bring water to one passenger early, others will start asking for the same thing. I'm sure you can wait like everyone else." People looked at what was going on, but didn't say anything. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and others quickly turned away as if they were paying attention. Sienna Hale, a junior flight attendant, stood near the galley and watched what was happening. She hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides, but she didn't say anything. She was new to her job and had quickly learned that questioning Mara Rowan wasn't a good idea. Leora, who was sitting next to Eddie, touched his hand gently and told him to calm down. She wasn't the type to argue over small things. But Edric, even though he was patient, didn't like it when people were treated unfairly. He took his hand off the call button and nodded as if he agreed with Mara's choice. Mara, happy that the conversation was over, turned on her heel and walked away without saying a word. Edric leaned back in his seat, his expression saying nothing, but he reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, typed a simple message, sent it, and then set the alarm. Eddie put his phone on the tray table and looked out the window while clasping his hands together. Leora looked at him and asked him in a soft voice, "Are you sure you want to handle it this way?" Eddie smiled slightly, and his voice was just as quiet. "She'll learn soon enough," she said. The moment had passed, but something lingered in the air that Mara Rowan had missed. This wasn't even close to over. She had been working as a flight attendant for years and knew how to quickly turn down requests that weren't necessary. First-class service was about luxury, but it was also about keeping order. If she started breaking the rules for one passenger, she'd be running back and forth the whole flight, and she wasn't going to put up with that. At the front of the plane, near the galley, Sienna Hale watched Marrera with uneasy eyes. She was still new to first class, but something about how Marrera handled the situation didn't feel right to her. If they only asked for water, would it have been so much trouble to give him a glass? She hesitated before speaking up. "Are you sure about that?" she asked in a low voice so that other passengers wouldn't hear. The woman looked very tired. Mary gave her a sharp look, clearly annoyed. "Sienna, if you want to last in first class, you need to stop second-guessing how things are done. They can wait like everyone else." Sienna reluctantly agreed, but the uncomfortable feeling didn't go away. Mara would do this before letting people go who she didn't think were important. Usually, it was very subtle in a way that no one would complain about, but this time, something felt off. Meanwhile, Edric Whitmore sat back in his seat and watched how Mara moved from passenger to passenger, smiling warmly at some and barely noticing others. Leora had closed her eyes and was trying to rest, but Edric could see a slight frown on her face. She wasn't upset, but he knew she was. The phone vibrated softly on the tray table, and he picked it up. Glancing at the screen, he saw the message received. He smiled briefly, then turned off the screen and put the phone back down. There was no need to act quickly. The plane was already in the air, and the problem would be solved soon enough. Marrera continued her rounds, stopping by a well-dressed businessman in seat 1C and offering him a drink with a professional smile. "Would you like champagne or a cocktail to start?" she asked him. The man barely looked up from his tablet. He said, "Just water, please," and Mara nodded. "Of course, sir," she said, pouring a glass from the chilled bottle behind her and setting it gently on his desk. She even added a napkin to make sure the presentation was perfect. Eddie watched the exchange with his face blank. He didn't say a word and didn't even look at Mira, but the message was clear. When she turned down something as simple as water for him and Leora, saying it was against protocol, she unintentionally showed that she wasn't saying no. Leora slowly opened her eyes and moved closer to him. She had heard the businessman's request and seen how smoothly Mira had complied. She didn't say anything, just put her hand on Eddie's arm and felt the quiet strength in him. Sienna, who was standing a few feet away, also noticed that her stomach was twitching as she watched Mira move through the cabin, charmingly appending to some passengers while ignoring others. Before she could stop herself, she took a small step forward and whispered. She said under her breath, "That's different." Mira barely looked at her. "That's different." Kian was a regular in first class. Sienna's breath caught in her throat. The way Mira said it, as if it were an unspoken rule that everyone should know, made her want to say more, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Mira was senior staff, and questioning her too much could put Sienna's job at risk. Across the cabin, Edric calmly picked up his phone. Again, he typed a short message and set it down again. "Make sure the captain is informed," he said. "Don't get into a fight, let her finish her work." Leora let out a soft breath, and Edric could hear it. "She still doesn't know, does she?" Edric asked. "Not yet." The plane kept flying through the sky, steady and uninterrupted, but something was already changing inside the cabin, and Mara Rowan had no idea that her time and control were running out. She moved through the first-class cabin. She walked through the cabin with confidence, not aware of the quiet storm brewing around her. She had been doing this job for years and thought she knew exactly how things worked. Frequent flyers, people who looked like they belonged, and people who were just filling seats. She didn't even look twice at Edric and Leor Whitmore as she went about her work. She thought they had been handled. They weren't bothersome, just an elderly couple who had probably saved up for this one flight she didn't want to give up. Edric sat calmly with his hands folded in his lap. He didn't look annoyed or impatient. In fact, he looked completely at ease. But inside, he was watching every moment and every decision Mira was making. Leora stayed quiet next to him, but he knew she was also paying attention. A soft ping went through the intercom, and a deep, steady voice said, "Rowan, please report to the cockpit." Mira frowned a little, but she didn't hesitate. She straightened her uniform and walked quickly to the front. Sienna, who had been watching everything happen, took a deep breath. Something was happening in the cockpit. Captain Roland Vance turned to face Mira as she walked in. He couldn't read Mira's face, but there was a weight in his eyes. On the screen in front of him, an executive call was coming through on the in-flight phone. Mira's stomach twisted a little, because she had never been called in here during a flight before. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but firm. "Received a priority message about your service in first class, and we need you to clarify a situation." I stiffened and said, "Of course, sir." "What's the matter?" There was a pause, and then the voice continued. "An elderly couple in seats 2A and 2B requested water before the meal service, which you denied them." My heartbeat sped up. "Yes, but you later served water to another passenger without issue." The cockpit felt smaller, and the air felt heavier. Mira straightened, trying to keep her voice calm. "Well, I was following him," I said. Captain Vance gave her a long, unreadable look and then pressed a button to unmute the call. "Rowan, do you know who the couple in 2A and 2B are?" asked Ms. Rowan. "No, I don't." Mira blinked, confused by the question. The voice on the other end of the call answered before she could finish. It was Eddie and Leor Whitmore. "They own the airline." Mira felt the ground drop from under her, and her mouth went dry. Her mind went straight to how she had talked to them and how she had refused to give them a second chance. Service to the people who built the airline she worked for. The voice on the other end of the line was no longer neutral, it was ice cold. "You will return to them immediately. You will correct your mistake. And when we land, you will have to explain your actions to the executive board. Do you understand?" Mira swallowed her dry throat. "Yes, sir." Captain Vance let out a sharp breath and turned back to his controls. "You'd better get back to work," he said. The weight of what she had done was finally hitting her, and she had no idea how much worse things were about to get. Mira stepped out of the cockpit, her breath coming faster than usual. The steady hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, but she barely heard it for the first time. Her mind was racing, replaying every word from the executive call where she had embarrassed the airline's owners. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to keep a neutral expression on her face so that the passengers wouldn't know something was wrong. Her hands trembled a little as she spoke. Your Sienna stood near the galley and watched Mira walk by. She noticed a short flicker of unease in Mira's face, which she had never seen before. Mira Rowan was always in charge and sure of herself, but now she looked like she had just seen a ghost. Mira stopped a few steps away from Eddie and Laura's seats and looked at them for the first time. Eddie was sitting comfortably, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. Leora remained poised, her fingers lightly touching the table. Sitting on her lap. They weren't mad or demanding anything, they were just waiting. Mira cleared her throat and stooped a bit to be at eye level with them. Her voice was softer now, but it still had that forced professionalism about it. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, she said, there was a misunderstanding earlier. I'd like to offer you some refreshments. Edric turned his head slowly to meet her gaze and repeated the word misunderstanding. His voice was quiet and steady, but there was something in it that made Maya's skin prickle. Eddie asked with an unreadable expression, "Did you not realize how important we were?" Maya's face burned. "No, sir, that's not what I meant." Leora spoke for the first time, her voice calm and almost gentle. "You didn't hesitate to serve other passengers, just us," she said. Maya could feel the weight of their words settle in her chest. A few people nearby turned their heads slightly, to pretend not to listen, but very alert. Edric leaned forward a little and asked, "Miss Rowan, why did you think we didn't belong here?" Mara opened her mouth but didn't say anything. There was no way to explain it that wouldn't sound fake. She had made a terrible mistake. She swallowed hard and said, "I misjudged the situation." Edric looked at her for a long time and then leaned back in his seat. "If you're going to apologize, Miss Rowan, I suggest you do it properly," he said. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years learning how to control her anger. In situations like this, she was in charge of following the rules and keeping things in order, but now she wasn't. She took a shaky breath and said quietly, "I'm sorry." Leora gave her a small nod, but didn't say anything else. Eric didn't thank her, because he didn't need to. Mara stood there for a moment longer, feeling exposed by their silence. She quickly turned and walked back toward the galley. Her uniform suddenly felt too tight, and her authority was gone. She had never felt this small before, and it was the first time she felt. Mara moved quickly toward the galley, her heart racing in a way it never had before from the weight of Edward's stare and the quiet authority in Laura's voice. It was unlike any other person she had ever met. This wasn't a passenger who would raise their voice and demand money or threaten to file a complaint. This was even worse. Edward Whitmore could end her career with one decision, and she had just given him that decision. Sienna was still standing near the service station when Mara walked by her. Sienna asked carefully, noticing that Mara's face was losing color. Mara ignored her and reached for a tray, her hand shaking as she put her glasses on as if she were trying to focus. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sienna said quietly. "I think I just ruined my entire career," Mira said under her breath as she closed her eyes for a second and frowned. "What do you mean?" Sienna asked, looking toward the first-class cabin where Edric and Leora were still calm and composed. Although she didn't want to say what happened in the cockpit, she could feel Sienna's eyes on her, pressing her for an answer. Before Mara could say anything, the in-flight phone rang sharply, and Sienna reached for it before Mara could stop her from picking up the receiver. "First-class galley," she said professionally, pausing to raise an eyebrow or two. "Yes, she's here," she said professionally, holding out the phone to Mara. "It's for you," she said. The voice on the other end was cut off, and the message said, "Direct M. Rowan, the executive team has been briefed. You are to report to the boardroom as soon as you land." Mr. Whitmore had asked for a full review of what happened, and there would be a disciplinary hearing. Mara felt like the air had been sucked out of her chest. "I acknowledged the voice. I acknowledged the call cut off." Mara swallowed hard and tightened her grip on the receiver before slowly setting it back in place. Sienna had been watching closely. "What was that?" About Maya sharply told her, "Don't worry about anything else, just focus on the service." But she knew that she had spent years working her way up in the airline, enforcing rules, and believing she was untouchable, and now it was all slipping through her fingers. She took a deep breath and forced herself to stand up straighter and keep moving to act like she still had control, but she knew she had lost it the moment she fired the wrong passengers, and there was no going back. Mira's hand shook a little as she picked up a tray of drinks, But she had to keep moving because she had to look normal and act like nothing was wrong. But the weight in her chest was getting heavier with every second. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, calmed down tense situations, and even gotten complaints, but this was different. This wasn't just about a mistake, it was about someone she had chosen to dismiss. She walked back into the first-class cabin, careful to keep her face neutral. Edric Whitmore was. He was still sitting comfortably and lightly tapping his fingers on the armrest. He looked completely at ease, as if he had forgotten what they had said earlier, but Mara knew better. Leora was sitting next to him, reading the in-flight magazine. She was the picture of quiet elegance. Mara avoided making eye contact with them as she walked past them. She stopped at row 3 when another passenger signaled for a drink. She smiled politely and forced her voice into its usual pleasant tone. "Can I get you anything?" the man asked. "What do you want?" she answered. He asked for coffee. She quickly turned back toward the galley, her mind racing. People in the first-class cabin were starting to pay attention. Some hadn't seen the earlier exchange, but rumors were starting to spread. A woman across the aisle had leaned toward her husband and been whispering something, and a man a few rows back kept looking between Mara and the Whitmore as if putting the pieces together. Even if she wanted to act like nothing had happened, it was clear that something wasn't right. Sienna stood near the galley door, watched as Mara went back to make the coffee. She hesitated before speaking, keeping her voice low. "I know you don't want to talk, but I think you should be ready," she said. Sienna bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "You embarrassed them, and now people are realizing it. They're whispering, watching." Maya's chest tightened. She wanted to scream at Sienna to shut up, but deep down she knew she didn't want to. She knew the younger flight attendant was right. She had handled the situation earlier, or at least she thought she had. But now she couldn't control what people were thinking, what they were telling themselves, or how they were starting to look at her differently. She grabbed the coffee pot and forced herself to calm down. There were still a few hours left on the flight, and she had to find a way to make it through them. She put the cup down with a small smile to act like everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. As she turned to walk back toward the galley, she felt the weight of several eyes following her. She had spent years working in first class, always carrying herself with competence and believing she had authority. Now, with every step she took, that authority felt like it was slipping away. She looked back at Edric and Leora, but they weren't looking at her. Edric was scrolling through his phone and tapping it every once in a while. Leora, who was as calm as ever, was drinking sparkling water from a message she had received from another flight attendant after IA had turned it down earlier. It hurt to realize that someone else had served them and done the job she was supposed to do. Mara took a deep breath and hidden herself before going back to the galley. But as she walked past row 1, a passenger, a middle-aged woman in a tailored blazer, spoke up and said, "Excuse me." Mara smiled and replied, "Yes, ma'am." The woman's face showed that she was polite, but "I was just wondering, when exactly did the rules change about when water can be served?" Myra's stomach flicked, but she kept her smile on her face. "I'm sorry," the woman said, making a subtle gesture toward Eric and Leora. "I heard what you told them earlier, and then I saw you serve water to another passenger 5 minutes later." She tilted her head slightly, just curious what the policy is, since it seems to change depending on who's asking me. Myra's grip on her tray tightened, and her throat felt dry. Other passengers turned their heads subtly, but purposely to adjust their seats or look at their watches while listening intently. Mara's heart was racing. She could try to defend herself to come up with an excuse, or she could keep her response short and neutral in the hopes that the woman would drop it. She forced another smile and said, "I'm sorry if there was any confusion, ma'am. That wasn't my intention." The woman raised an eyebrow, not convinced. Mara could feel the tension. Every second felt heavier, and the stares were sharper. She needed to get out of this situation before things got worse. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked quickly, hoping to change the subject. The woman let the silence last a little too long, before slowly nodding, "Just water." Mara clenched her jaw and nodded, and she ran back to the galley, her heart racing. Sienna was already there, watching everything happen, so she said in a low voice, "That went well." A sharp look that said drop it. Sienna raised her hands in surrender, but there was something in her eyes that said she knew exactly what was going on, and that she wasn't the only one. Mara grabbed a bottle of water and a glass to make the drink, but her hands weren't as steady as they had been before. The weight of her mistake was getting heavier by the minute, and no matter how much she tried to act like she was still in charge, it was becoming clearer that she wasn't just losing the respect of the Whitmore. When Mara put the water glass on the tray, her hands shook a little. She took a deep breath and stepped back into the cabin. She knew she needed to calm down, but the air in first class felt different, like an unspoken tension had settled between the rows. She carefully carried the tray to row 1 and put the glass of water in front of the woman who had asked her question. She thought the woman would say something or push the issue further, but all she did was stare. Took the glass, gave Mara a knowing look, and went back to reading her book. Mira quickly turned around, ready to leave, but as she passed Eddie and Laura's seats, she heard a soft voice, "Miss Rowan." She stopped in her tracks. Leora had spoken, and her voice was both soft and firm. Mira slowly turned, her stomach twisting because she didn't want to look the woman in the eyes, but she had no choice. Leora put down her magazine and looked up at her with the same quiet grace she had kept up the whole flight. "How much longer until we land?" Mira asked, caught off guard by the question. About 2 hours had passed since the question was asked. Leora nodded as if she were thinking about something, then she smiled in a polite, soft, but clearly deliberate way. That was a lot of time. Mara didn't know why, but those words gave her chills. Eddie, who had been silent, finally spoke without looking up from his phone. "Miss Rowan, do you believe in accountability?" he asked. Mara's breath caught, she opened her mouth, but no words came out. He wasn't accusing her, nor was he angry, it was just a test. Sir Edric finally looked at her, and she felt the weight of his authority for the first time. He wasn't threatening, he was a man who had built something and had spent decades learning about power, influence, and most of all, how people showed who they were through the choices they made. "Good," he said simply, and then he turned back to his phone, dismissing her with nothing more than silence. Maya stood there for a moment longer, not sure if she should say anything or try to save the situation. What was left was for her to say. What could she say that would make this better? She quickly turned and walked back toward the galley, feeling a prickling heat spread across her skin. She had made many mistakes in her career, had to deal with difficult passengers, and had even gotten complaints that never went anywhere. But this was different. This wasn't a complaint that would be buried under paperwork, and it wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained away. She had treated Eric and Leora Whitmore unfairly, not because of policy or airline rules, but because of a choice she had made that was now eroding her authority in front of the whole cabin, and the worst part was that she didn't know what she could do to stop it. The phone rang again, and Sienna picked it up. This time, her face tightened as she listened to the voice on the other end. She glanced at Marrera, hesitating before holding out the receiver. "It's for you," she said in a voice that was hard to understand. Marrera's stomach turned. She knew who it was before she even picked up the phone. "This is Mira Rowan," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "This is Dominic Carter, head of cabin crew operations." The response came right away. "This is Mira Rowan." Mira closed her eyes for a moment. She had never spoken to Dominic Carter directly before. He was 2 levels above her in the airline's hierarchy and dealt with serious issues, not minor offenses. He continued without waiting for her answer. "Upon landing, you will report directly to the executive boardroom. There will be a. Do you understand?" Mara's throat went dry as she answered, "Yes, sir." There was a brief silence, and then his voice dropped slightly, carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. "You should know something, Miss Rowan," he said. "Mr. Whitmore isn't the type to demand punishments." Mara felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly dashed when he said, "Heck, the type to change policies." It wasn't just about her anymore. The way she had handled this flight had become a turning point in airline policy. Carter said, "Don't talk to the WTM Maoris again. Your time with them is over. The executive team will handle the rest." The call ended, and Mara lowered the phone slowly, her hands icy cold. Sienna was still watching her. She had heard enough to understand. "Are you?" Sienna asked, but Mira cut her off. "I don't want to talk," she snapped, her voice sharper than she meant. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as the weight of the situation hit her. For years, she had carried herself with confidence. As a result, she wasn't allowed to talk to the passengers she had harmed, and for the first time in her career, Mara Rowan realized she had no control over anything. Maya stared at the in-flight phone, its silent presence mocking her. Her mind was racing, but the reality of the situation was setting in quickly. There was no getting out of this, no making things right, no filing a simple report, and moving on. She had lost control of the flight of her authority, and now she was losing control of her own future. Was still looking at her from across the galley with her arms crossed and a cautious face. She wanted to say something, but she knew better than to push Mira when she was like this. Mira's breath came out slowly and shakily. She needed to calm down. She needed to act like nothing was happening. She needed to act like she wasn't about to face a disciplinary hearing that could end her career. With stiff movements, she reached for a tray of meal service items as if she could make herself disappear by arranging them. "Keep busy," Sienna stepped forward quietly. "You do know what's going on, don't you?" Mara clenched her jaw and said, "Not now, Sienna." "I think now is the perfect time," speaking softly but firmly. "Because you keep acting like this is just a bad passenger interaction, and it'll go away when we land." Mara's hands tightened around the tray. "See?" Sienna asked, lowering her voice. "You didn't just insult any first-class passenger, Mara. You dismissed Eric and Leora Whitmore, the people who own the airline." Sienna shook her head and asked, "Do you know what that means?" "It means that whatever happens when we land isn't just about you. It's about what changes because of you." Maya's stomach turned, but she didn't answer. Sienna took another step forward and said, "I've seen you ignore passengers before. I've seen you make those little choices where you decide who gets special treatment and who doesn't." She paused and looked directly at Maya. "But this time you made the wrong choice, and now." Everyone is watching. Maya's eyes snapped to hers, and the tension between them was thick and unspoken. Sienna was right. Maya had always been careful and subtle, but this time she had picked the wrong people to fire, and now the real-time consequences were happening. People in first class were whispering, and she could feel the change in energy. They had seen what happened, they had noticed the unfairness and inconsistency, and now, even if none of them spoke up directly, they would remember, and if they did remember, they would talk. She had seen it happen before, one passenger telling the right person about a minor incident on social media, and suddenly it turned into a company-wide scandal. Her chest tightened. She needed to think. She needed a way out of this. Mira pressed her fingers against her temple and took a deep breath. I can fix this, she whispered to herself. I can. No, Sienna cut in, shaking her head. You can't. Mira blinked, shocked at the finality in Sienna's voice. Sienna's face was hard to read, but there was something like. There was disappointment in her eyes as she said, there's nothing you can say to make this better. The decision isn't yours anymore. Maya's breath caught a little as she realized that she had spent years making decisions and controlling how things went, but now she was just waiting for a verdict. For someone like Mara, that was the worst punishment of all. The thought made her stomach turn, but before she could say anything, another voice came over the intercom. Cabin crew, prepare for initial descent. The words sent a new wave of fear through Maya. She had never felt so scared before. She wanted the flight to last longer, because once they landed, she would no longer be in charge, she would be being judged. Mara swallowed hard as the captain's voice faded from the background noise. The weight in her chest grew heavier. The initial descent meant that there were less than 30 minutes left until landing. Less than 30 minutes before she had to get off the plane, walk through the airport, and go into a boardroom full of executives who were already waiting for her. She had spent years running first class and setting the rules for years. She was in charge of deciding who got extra attention and who didn't, but now she was going to be judged on every choice she made on this flight. It would be used to decide if she would have a future with this airline at all. Sienna was still watching her from the galley, but this time she didn't say anything because there was nothing else to say. Maya forced herself to stand up straight. She could let this break her, or she could act like she was still in love. She pretended to be busy by adjusting the meal service trays. If she focused on the small tasks, she might be able to calm down the storm inside her. But as she walked into the first-class cabin, she noticed something. People weren't just looking at her, they were watching her. It was a subtle, but clear change. The businessman in row 1 barely looked up from his tablet, but she saw the way his fingers hesitated before tapping the screen. The woman who had asked her earlier was watching her. She had her arms crossed and kept looking at Eddie and Leora, as if she were waiting for something. Even the flight attendants walking down the aisle seemed to be moving more slowly around her, as if they didn't want to be involved with whatever was going to happen. Mara's heart beat faster. She wasn't invisible anymore. For years, she had been able to move through flights with authority, choosing which passengers were important and which ones weren't. Now she was the subject of quiet decisions. When she got to the front of the cabin, she saw Leora sitting with her hands folded in her lap, still looking very calm. Eric was typing something on his phone, but his face couldn't be read. Myra's mouth dried up. The Whitmore hadn't looked at her since she had to say sorry, which was worse than if they had been openly angry. She wanted to say something, but she knew that the moment had passed and her fate was no longer in her hands. Instead, she turned around, stiffly getting ready to walk back to the galley when the in-flight phone rang again. The sound made her flinch for the first time, and she hesitated before answering. She didn't want to hear what was going to happen next, but she couldn't ignore it either. With forced calm, she picked up the receiver and pressed it to her ear. "This is Mara Rowan," a deep, calm voice said. "This is James Caldwell, Vice President of Operations." Myra's breath caught. "James Caldwell," she said. "I've never spoken to him directly. I've only seen his name in corporate emails and announcements. If he was involved, this wasn't just an internal reviewer. It was an issue of executive-level discipline." She gripped the phone tighter and quickly said, "Yes, sir." There was a pause, and then his voice came through, even and steady. "Upon landing, you are to remain on board until you are escorted by security to the executive office. You will not be fired with the rest of the cabin crew. Maya's stomach dropped. Security, she said again. Yes, you are being suspended immediately pending further action. She was expecting a formal hearing, or maybe a written reprimand, but instead she heard suspension. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. James Caldwell kept talking, making it clear that there was no room for argument. A statement has already been filed. Mr. Whitmore had personally asked that this matter be reviewed at the highest level. Maya's heart sank. This was worse than she thought. Edric Whitmore wasn't demanding her firing, he wasn't making a scene, he was doing something much more powerful. Made sure that her actions were written down, looked at closely, and used as a model for future behavior change. She could already picture the news stories: unfair treatment in first class, airline workers silently judging, rules being changed because of a decision made at 30,000 feet. Her mind was spinning. Caldwell's voice cut through the fog. Do you understand these instructions, Miss Rowan Mara? She swallowed hard, her throat felt tight. Yes, sir, we land in 20 minutes. The call ended with a sharp click, and Mara slowly put the phone down. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and she turned her head a little. For the first time, her eyes met Edric Whitmore's. He hadn't looked at her since they had first talked, but now, as the clock struck 0, he lifted his eyes and held hers. There was no anger or gloating in his face. Instead, it was quiet, measured authority, which made it worse because it meant he had already won. Mara turned sharply and walked toward the galley, her movement stiff and. There were 20 minutes left on the flight, and then she would have to get off the plane and face whatever fate was waiting for her. It was the first time in her career that she was scared. As the final descent began and passengers adjusted their seats to get ready for landing, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Mara stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The cold press of reality hit her harder than it had ever felt before. This wasn't just a warning, this wasn't just another complaint that needed to be dealt with in a normal review meeting. It was a reckoning. She took a deep breath and tried to keep her hands from shaking. She had to keep it together at least until they landed, because no one could see how weak she was. She had always been in charge and made the rules, but now she was just a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. The airline executives weren't just looking at her as an employee who had made a mistake, they were looking at her as a lesson and a warning. And Edric Whitmore hadn't yelled or demanded an apology, he had done something much worse, he had started something. Mara turned her head slightly and peered out into the first-class cabin. She could still feel the change in the air, from the way people were whispering and side-eyeing her when they thought she wasn't looking. Some of them would forget about what happened by the time they got to their final destination, but others would talk about it, telling their families, friends, and maybe even posting about it on social media. People talked about it online, and once the story got out, it wouldn't just be about me or Rowan, it would be about every other time someone had been fired because they didn't look like they belonged, every unspoken rule, and every biased decision that was made in silence. The thought of Sienna still watching her from across the galley made her heart race, but she didn't say anything this time, the look in her eyes was enough. Mara quickly turned away, unable to face that knowing look when the final announcement came. Through the intercom, ladies and gentlemen, we are making our final approach. Please ensure that all passengers are securely stowed, their seat belts are fastened, and their tray tables are up. Passengers moved in their seats, adjusting themselves for the familiar jolt of wheels hitting the tarmac. For most of them, this was just another flight. For Mara, it was the last few minutes of her career as she knew it. Her breath came out slowly and unevenly, and then it happened, the plane touched down with a smooth landing. The usual soft gasps of. For everyone else, the journey was over after the descent. For her, it was just beginning. She stayed frozen in place, her stomach twisting with each second that went by. She could hear the seat belt signs going off, the soft rustling of people reaching for their bags, and the quiet murmur of conversation filling the air again. She could almost pretend that this was just a normal landing until she saw them, the security officers they were waiting at. Two flight attendants stood stiffly in their uniforms at the front of the plane, eyes fixed on the door, as if they were waiting for someone. Mira's body went cold. This wasn't just a suspension, she was being escorted. It hit her hard that she wasn't going to walk off the plane like every other flight attendant, head held high, ready for her next duty shift. She was being taken away in public. Some people in first class noticed this as well. Some people already knew what was going on, and those who didn't would soon enough. Mira clenched her jaw and tried to keep a blank face, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She wasn't used to being watched, she was used to being in charge. She turned her head a little and looked at Edric and Leo, or Whitmore. They hadn't moved, they were still sitting there, calm as if they knew all along how this flight was going to end for her. Edric looked at his watch. They were impatient, but not cocky. They were just happy that things were going as they should. For a split second, Leora's eyes met Mira's. There was no tension or hostility, just understanding. And that was even worse for Mira. She wanted them to be angry, demanding, and loud. She wanted something she could fight back against, something she could explain away. But this was justice moving forward without her. Mira took a deep breath and braced herself. She had no choice. The plane doors opened, and people in first class slowly stood up. Some of them looked at her curiously, while others pretended not to notice. Maya stayed where she was, because she knew what was going to happen. One of the security officers walked up and stopped right next to her. His voice was calm and professional. "Miss Rowan, please come with us." This wasn't a request, it was the final confirmation. Myra's chest tightened, but she nodded stiffly and walked past rows of passengers who had once seen her as someone in charge, but now saw her as someone who had lost control. No one stopped her or spoke up for her as she walked down the aisle, her steps stiff and forced. As she stepped off the plane and out of the first-class cabin, she realized something. It had never been about the water or a single mistake. It had always been about the choice she made and the people she made it against, and now she would have to live with that choice forever. Mira stepped into the jet bridge, where the cold artificial air hit her like a slap and the distant hum of air. Airport noise could be heard through the walls, but inside it was too quiet to be comfortable. Two security guards stood on either side of her, walking in time with her stiff, measured steps. She had always felt confident walking through airports with her uniform on like a badge of honor, but now she felt like a prisoner being led to her sentence. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out of this, a way to spin the story to make what had happened seem less serious so she could save what was left of her career. Maybe if she said it was just a misunderstanding. Deep down, she knew this wasn't about protocol or whether she had followed airline policy. It was about how she had used her authority, and now the people who had given it to her were taking it away. The doors at the end of the jet bridge slid open, revealing the terminal. Mira's breath caught when she saw two airline executives waiting just beyond security clearance. One of them was a tall man with silver streaks in his hair and a shark suit. His name was James Caldwell, vice president of Operations. Stood with his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't have to say anything for Mira to know that this wasn't just an internal review. Next to him was Dominic Carter, head of cabin crew operations. Carter's face was blank, but Mira could tell that he wasn't here to listen to her excuses. Behind her, passengers from the flight were starting to come into the terminal. She saw some of them whispering to each other and others pulling out their phones. She had a sudden feeling of fear. Were they recording? She could already see the news stories and social media posts about the rumor that a first-class flight attendant was escorted off the plane by security after a fight with airline owners. The thought made her sick. James Caldwell looked at Mira and Miss Rowan, and then he said, "Follow us." The security officer moved out of the way, and Mira forced her legs to move. She kept her shoulders straight and her face neutral, but she was scared. She followed Caldwell and Carter through some private airport hallways, out of sight from the public. The walls were stark white, and the overhead lights were too bright. With each step, she heard a steady drum beat counting down to whatever fate was waiting for her at the end of the hallway. After a few minutes, they stopped in front of a frosted glass door with a metal plaque that said Executive Review Room. Caldwell swiped his badge and pushed the door open, revealing a long, sleek conference table that took up the whole room. Executives were already seated, and Edric Whitmore was at the head of the table. Mira's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than she thought. This wasn't just a disciplinary review, this was personal. The weight of what she had done fell fully on her shoulders. She had thought that Edric Whitmore and his wife didn't belong, and now she was standing in his space on his terms. Qual pointed to a seat across from Edric Whitmore. Mira hesitated. Her gut told her to run away from the crushing pressure. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Edric Whitmore sat back in his chair, calm and composed. He stared at her for a long time, his fingers intertwined. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Rowan," he asked in a steady voice, "do you know why you're here?" Maya's throat tightened as she answered, "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "Good." There was another pause, and then Edric leaned forward a little. "Tell me," he said in a voice that carried the full weight of who he was. "Did you think we didn't?" There was no right answer to that question, and there never had been. Mira's throat felt dry, and her palms were sweaty against the smooth surface of the conference table. The air in the room felt heavier than it should have, and the silence between her and Edric Whitmore felt like an unbearable weight pressing down on her chest. She had been through tough conversations with angry passengers, impatient executives, and tense discussions with crew members, but this was the first time she had to deal with it. Suddenly, she was looking into the eyes of a man who could change her whole future with just a few words. Edric's gaze was steady and patient, asking, "Why did you think we didn't belong?" She tried to think of every excuse and justification she had practiced before entering the room, but none of them worked, because there was no good reason that wouldn't make her look worse. Mira swallowed hard and tightened her fingers around the hem of her uniform skirt. Looked around the room for anything or anyone that might help ease the unbearable stress she was feeling. James Caldwell and Dominic Carter were sitting on either side of Eric, waiting with blank looks on their faces. 3 other executives whose names she didn't know looked at her in silence. But the worst thing was that Leora Whitmore was also there. She was sitting a few seats down, looking as elegant as ever with her fingers resting on a white ceramic cup of tea that someone had placed in front of her. Unlike Eric, she wasn't looking at Mira. Mira forced herself to answer, "I didn't mean," but Edric stopped her before she could dig a deeper hole. "Let me be clear, Miss Rowan," he said in a low voice. "I'm not asking for a corporate buzzword or a carefully rehearsed explanation." He tilted his head slightly and said, "I'm asking for the truth." Mira's heart raced. She had been trained to handle tough conversations, calm down situations, and shift blame without making it clear, but none of that helped her. Those strategies wouldn't work here, because she was already on display. Her mouth opened and closed several times. She didn't have an answer that wouldn't make her look like the exact person the airline would want to get rid of. Edric leaned back a little to watch her hesitation. "You were comfortable denying U.S. service, M. Rowan. You were competent when you made that choice. Where is that competence now?" Maya's stomach churned. She looked at James Caldwell, hoping he would step in, but all he did was adjust his watch. Emma was by herself and taking shaky breaths. "I didn't mean to treat you unfairly," she finally said, choosing her words carefully. "I made a misjudgment." Leora stirred her tea slowly with a small spoon, finally lifting her eyes to meet Mira's. "A misjudgment," she repeated, her voice as smooth as silk. Interesting. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. Eddie put his hands together on the table and said, "Let's test that theory." He gave a small nod. "Then tell me, Ms. Rowan, how often do you judge first-class passengers wrong? How often do you refuse simple requests from people who don't look the part?" Maya froze. That was it. That was the track. If she denied it, she would sound defensive, like she was trying to erase her past behavior. If she admitted it, she would be confirming exactly what Eddie already knew. Either way, she had already lost. She gripped the edge of her seat, her breathing uneven, and Leora set her teaspoon down on the saucer with a quiet clink. "I think we both knew the answer." She said it softly, and Mara's chest tightened. She had spent years moving through first class, choosing who bought extra care, who bought the easy smiles, who bought priority service without question, and who didn't. She had done it so many times and so smoothly that she had never stopped to think about what it meant until now. Edric let out a sigh, but it wasn't one of exhaustion or irritation. Instead, it was a deliberate pause that let the silence settle around her. He then looked at James Caldwell and asked, "Is this the kind of leadership?" Maya's stomach dropped as James, who had been quiet until now, adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket. He didn't look at her when he answered, "No, sir." The finality of those two words sent a shockwave through her. She was losing it all. Mara straightened up a little and forced out, "I understand that I made a mistake, but you didn't make a mistake." Edric cut her off. "A mistake is forgetting to bring someone their coffee or mixing up their meal orders." Leaned in a little closer and said, "What you did was a choice." The word cut through her like a knife, and she felt her breath catch and her calm slip further away with each second that went by. "What you did to us today, Miss Rowan?" "We've been treated that way before," Leora said in a soft but firm voice. "I wonder if we weren't the owners of the airline, would you have ever given it a second thought?" Maya didn't have an answer, and that was enough. A short time had passed before Frederick leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh of relief. He then turned to James Caldwell and said, "She's done here." Caldwell nodded, but his face couldn't be read. "Effective immediately," he said, "Mara Rowan's employment with the airline is terminated." Maya's hands shook violently under the table as she begged, "Please," her voice barely above a whisper. "Isn't there?" Frederick asked. "There's nothing else to say," she said. She put the cup down gently and said, "I think you should take some time to think about what kind of person you've chosen to be." Edric followed suitably, buttoning his jacket as he walked toward the door. The other executives followed suitably. Mara sat completely frozen, her mind racing as she watched the people who held her fate in their hands walk away without a second glance. She wasn't just fired, they didn't even care. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving her alone with no job, no title, and no control for the first time in her life. Life for Maya Rowan was nothing. Mara sat frozen in the empty boardroom and stared at the spot where Edric and Leora Whitmore had been sitting moments before. The room was dead quiet, and the sound of their last words echoed in her head, each syllable louder than the last. She was fired, not just reprimanded, not suspended. She was done. She had always thought she was untouchable. She thought she knew the unspoken rules of first-class service and how things worked. She had always thought she was above everyone else. But today she was the one who was. She pushed the weight of the moment away, making it hard to breathe. Her nails were digging into her palms, and she knew this wasn't supposed to happen. All she had done was make the same quiet choices for years. When she turned down Eddie and Lior's requests for water, she hadn't thought twice because she didn't think she was doing anything wrong. But now she could see and hear the deafening silence that followed her decision. She had ignored the way passengers had started to talk. Instead of listening to Sienna's concerns or acting on what her coworker had tried to warn her about, she had ignored what was right in front of her, and now she was paying the price. Her heart was racing as she realized what had really happened. Not only had she lost her job, but her name and face would now be linked to something much bigger than herself. She could already picture how people would talk about the first-class flight attendant who was fired for mistreating the airline's owners. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was about how she got there. How many people had she treated differently over the years? How many passengers had sat in those seats and felt the weight of her silent judgment but said nothing? How many times had she brushed someone off because she thought they weren't important enough to matter? Her stomach turned as she realized for the first time that this was never about Eddie and Lior Whitmore. It was about everyone else, all the passengers before them, all the quiet wrongs she had done, and all the choices she had made. Had made without giving it much thought, and now she was just a reminder. Her name was linked to a case that would be used in training programs, corporate meetings, and discussions about bias in the airline industry. She was no longer Myra Rowan, senior flight attendant. She was Myra Rowan, the lesson. A loud knock at the door made her jump. The door swung open, and a security officer stepped in. His face was unreadable, but he said, "Miss Rowan, we need to take you out." Her mouth felt dry. As she slowly stood up, her legs felt unsteady, and her uniform felt too tight and heavy. The walk through the airport's private hallways was agonizingly long. The security officer didn't say a word, and neither did she. When they got to the crew exit, Mara hesitated for half a second before stepping outside. The bright lights felt harsh on her skin, and people walking by didn't even look in her direction. She had been a presence before other passengers. Crew members looked to for direction, but now she was just another face in the crowd. She didn't have a uniform, no authority, and no job. She was just Myra Rowan, another person walking out of an airport. She turned her head a little, and her eyes fell on a big digital board near the entrance to the terminal. There was a new announcement. Whitmore Airlines implements new first-class service policy, stricter bias training for all cabin crew effective immediately. Mare's breath caught in her throat, and her hands shook as she stared. It hit her hard that what she had done wasn't just noticed. They had changed the airline's policy, which meant that things would be handled differently from now on, and her name would never be forgotten. She took a slow, shaky step forward, but there was nowhere she was going, no uniform to go back to, no flight schedule, and no next assignment. She had spent her whole career thinking she was in charge, but now she was just another person watching the world go by without her. She could no longer stop it. If you liked this story, please like the video and let us know what you think in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thank you for your support.